So I would like to welcome everybody to today's webinar series. I apologize, there's been a little delay. There's a technical snag at our end, so we apologize for that. And our IT expert has just set it up. He had to move to a different location to start the whole thing. So I don't think this happens again and again. We are sorry for this. And today's topic, as we all know, is a very important one, and we are all looking at this for a very long time. What is the economic impact of the pandemic across states in India? And to discuss this, we have a panel which is chaired by Professor Prasad Bezbarua. He's a professor of economics at Guwahati University. And what he's going to do is he's going to give us a glimpse of different states and also of Northeast. So with this, because of paucity of time, for the next 75 minutes, I'm handing over the mic to Professor Bezbarua to conduct the session. Professor.
Very good evening to all of you. And first of all, I begin by thanking Dr. Charan Singh and the whole EGROW team for having us here for this particular, in this platform to discuss an issue of national importance, of course. And we actually deeply appreciate Dr. Singh's effort to be very inclusive regarding the topics, subjects, regions, and also the academics, the members of the academic community. He's not limiting himself to the academics in the metropolitan centers, but he's also including others, people like us who are working in smaller, so-called smaller towns also. So thank you very much. So we move ahead now to discuss the topic, which is the impact of the pandemic across states. Here, states mean not only the states and union territories, so across regions of India. That means, we have a panel of three persons, of course. Mainly, this will be presented by two of my former students. I'm very proud to share this screen today with two of my former students who are very, and both have actually arisen from a very rather, you can say, humble background. Assam to make the names in the academic. Dr. Binoy, who is now part of Faculty of Economics of South Asian University. And then we have another young academic, Dr. Raju Mandal, who is a senior assistant professor in the Assam University, Silchar, which is again a central university. And Raju also was a Raman Fellow, the postdoctoral Raman Fellow in the Sam Houston State University, Texas, where he worked on climate change and agriculture and so on and so forth. But today's topic, as you all know, is basically on economic impact of this contagion on the various states of India. See, if you look at actually these two people, they have been doing a little bit of study along in collaboration with Professor Hiranya Nath, who is in again Sam Houston State University. So three of them have carried out a study to look into why there are variations in the impact on in the economic impact across the different states of India of this pandemic. And what they're trying to do is that we don't have, this whole thing cannot just explain in terms of incidence of COVID infections. We have to go beyond this. So they look into the structures of the economy. They look into the state of the economy before the pandemic broke out, and what are the composition of the sectoral composition, and they look into various their fiscal constraints and so on and so forth. In terms of that, they are trying to give us. They're going to give us an analysis of what we call this differential impact across states. So Binoy is going to first of all tell us about the background of the economy just before the pandemic, and he's also going to move on how the pandemic response has been taken up. Then Raju is going to talk about the impacts itself. Then when they are finished, so I'll be joining in with some background, I'll say more details about the Northeast region. So that will be Northeast specific, my presentation. This is, I think, Dr. Singh wants me to do that. So here, my main point will be that if you look at the Northeast India as just one unit, we miss some certain very important details. So we need to look slightly more detail in details into the Northeast India. So this is the plan of the thing. So without further wasting our time, I'll request Dr. Binoy Goswami to start his presentation. Binoy, please go ahead.
Okay. So, Isburwa, and thanks to EGROW Foundation for giving us this platform to share. Professor Baisborough has already mentioned that this is something that myself and Dr. Raju Mandal and Professor Hindernath from Sam Houston State University, we have been working on this. This is a work in progress. So we would like to share our work with you and also like to receive your comments and suggestions on that. So just give me a minute to share my slides. Just let me know when you can see the PowerPoint. If you can see the PowerPoint.
We can. Just make it full slide.
Okay. So, okay. So I'll be. The first one is economic performances of the states, and of course, it in the Union territories on the eve of COVID-19, and then the spread of the virus across states and the containment efforts put in by the states. Now, these two issues are important to understand. It is important that we analyze these two issues before we get into the impact of the pandemic on the state economies. That's because the impact is linked to these two issues. Because if, for example, a state was performing well, has been growing well, and its fiscal position was strong, then that state will be in a better position compared to other states which probably were not performing well or didn't have a strong fiscal position to contain the virus, to put in more effort. So they will be those states will be better placed to fight the pandemic. And of course, the second issue, it's obvious that the speed and the incidence of and the intensity of the spread of the virus, and subsequently the containment efforts that the states have put in, that obviously will determine or will influence that the pandemic will have on the state economies, or might have already had on the state economies. So with this background, I'm going to present these two issues before you, and thereafter Dr. Mandal will talk about the impact of the pandemic on the state economies. Okay, so the interstate differences in economic performances, on the eve of COVID-19. So here we have taken into consideration 4 indicators. One is the state gross domestic product, growth in state domestic, gross domestic product. Then the sectoral composition, unemployment rates, and the fiscal position of the states on the eve of the pandemic. First, the annual growth rates of state gross domestic product. There are a lot of numbers. Please, don't try to read these numbers. I will sum up the main points in the subsequent slides. All that I want to show here is, we have. So first, in the first column, we have the state's share in the national GDP. So this is the GDP share over this. So this is the average share over the sample period of 1994 to 2019-20. So we have taken this period as because this coincides with the post-reform period. So over this period, we have taken the average. And the first column shows the share of a union territory or a state in the national GDP. Second one shows the average growth rate of a state or a union territory. And of course, we have the national growth rate also, average annual growth rate also over this period. The third column shows the coefficient of variation in the growth rates which we take as a measure of vulnerability of a state, macroeconomic vulnerability of a state to a negative shock. And then 4th and 5th column shows the minimum and maximum growth during this period. 6th column, we estimate an alternative measure of vulnerability, which is the transition probabilities, because sometimes coefficient of variation could be misleading. And final column gives you the growth performance in the last year. But as you can see, for many states, 2019-20, that growth figure is not available. So we would largely ignore that column. So in terms of the growth performance, so first we look at the size of the state and their growth performances. So we have certain states which were growing above the national average, which was 6.75% during that sample period of 1993-94 to 2019-20. And some of the large states, and we define large states as those which have a contribution of 4% or more than 4% to the national GDP. And that includes largely so these large states which were performing growing above the national average are basically from the western and southern parts of India. As you can see, Gujarat, Karnataka, Telangana, Rajasthan, Tamil Nadu, and Maharashtra, these are large states which were performing above the national average throughout this sample period. Then you have some medium states and union territories. Again, here we define medium states are those which have a contribution of 1 to 4% to national GDP, and that include Delhi, Haryana, and Uttarakhand. And then some smaller states and UTs, which were growing again above the national average, and we define the smaller states as those which have a contribution of less than 1% to national GDP. And that includes basically 3 union territories, 2 smaller states, Goa and Himachal Pradesh, and 3 Tripura. On the other hand, we also have certain states which were growing below the national average. That again includes 2 bigger states from the southern part, Andhra Pradesh and Kerala, then one from north, which is Uttar Pradesh, and one from east, the West Bengal. National average, and medium state, and so it's the state are probably not strict. Then we move to the macroeconomic vulnerability of the states. Here, first we look at the coefficient of variation in the growth rates. So the growth rates is 1993-94, 2019-20, that sample period. So what is the variation or coefficient of variation of the growth rates? And there is a wide variation across states. And most of the smaller states, those states have high coefficient of variation. That means smaller states are more vulnerable. Though, of course, some relatively larger states like Jharkhand, Bihar, Rajasthan, and Chhattisgarh also experience high growth volatility. And then larger states like Kerala, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Telangana, Uttar Pradesh, and West Bengal, and some medium states and union territories experience stable growth during this period. And then for states like Andhra Pradesh, Gujarat, and Maharashtra, though it's not as high, the variability was not as high as like Jharkhand and Bihar or Rajasthan, but it was somehow higher as well. So basically the smaller states, along with 3-4 bigger states, relatively larger states like Jharkhand, Bihar, Rajasthan, and Chhattisgarh, these states were more vulnerable. If you use coefficient of variation, the variability in the growth performance or growth rate as an indicator of vulnerability. We believe that those states which do not experience stable growth, where the growth has been unstable, are more vulnerable. But as I said, variation as an indicator of vulnerability, then it could be misleading at times. The reason is, you have a state which has never experienced negative growth. But over this sample period, the range of growth that it has registered, it has experienced, is very high. So in some, for example, in some year, it might have experienced, a growth percentage of, growth rate of 15 or 16%. On the other hand, in another year, it might have experienced a growth rate of 2 or 3%. So there, the variability is going to be very high. On the other hand, you may have a stage where the growth rate, it has experienced negative growth, but the positive and negative growth, the growth rates are not very high. So there the variability could be low. But we would assume that we would like to believe that the states which have experienced negative growth will be more vulnerable. So therefore, to take into account that aspect, to take care of that limitation of coefficient of variation, so we also estimate the transition probabilities, the probability of transitioning a state from a position of positive growth to a position of negative growth. And this though transition probability can be estimated in a long-term horizon, since we are interested in short-term vulnerability, so we estimate these probabilities only for a year, that means 1 year horizons. And in our case, however, we have found that the probability, the transition and coefficient of variations largely confirm, they show the robust results. That means those states which have experienced high volatility in terms of coefficient of variations also show the high probability of transitioning from growth to decline, from a positive growth to a negative growth. Only with the exception of Sikkim. Sikkim, in terms of coefficient of variation, has high vulnerability, a high variability, but it doesn't show a probability of decline from growth in terms of transition probability. Then there are altogether 10 states in our sample, among the sample states, which do not show any probability of transitioning from positive to negative growth, and that includes some bigger states also, and like Karnataka, Kerala, Telangana, and West Bengal. So this gives us a picture of the vulnerability of the states. Then again, next issue, that next indicator we take up is that of unemployment rates. But again, here we have for all the states, don't bother about these graphs, these bars. Again, I will sum up the main points in the next slide, but only the last 4 bars, I would like to have a look at the last 4 bars, which is for India, and that shows that from 2017 onwards till 2019, the unemployment rate at the national level was increasing, which points to the fact that even before the pandemic, a slowdown in the economy, an economic slowdown probably already started. So economy was slowing down. If you look at other indicators also, some of the other indicators also point to that fact that the economy already started slowing down even before where higher unemployment rate was Delhi, Haryana, and currently the Union Territory of all these 4 years. In the month of March 2020, the national unemployment rate was 8.8%, which is 1 percentage point higher than what it was in the previous month, which was that is the February 2020. And in March, many states and union territories actually had an unemployment rate which was much higher than the national average, that is 8.8%. So this points to the fact that on the eve of even before the pandemic arrived, the economic condition in many states were already probably not so good. And this is going to play out in terms of the impact of the pandemic, because if the states were not already doing good economically, slowing down, then obviously the pandemic impact of the pandemic is going to be probably more severe on these states. Look at the sectoral compositions. Again, please ignore these numbers. I will sum up in the next slide. Just wanted to have here in terms of the sectoral compositions, we have the 3 main sectors: primary, secondary, and tertiary sectors. And then we also have the subsectors: agriculture, forestry and fishing, mining and quarrying, under primary sector, then manufacturing and construction under secondary, then tourism, hotel, restaurant, transport, financial service, and real estate under the services sector, because service sector included varieties of services. So all these we have information. This information we collected from the website of Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. For all these states, we had information from 2011-12 to 19-20, and in terms of the subsector and major sectors. So for each of these years, from 2011-12 to 2019-20, first, for each of these years, we estimated the sectoral shares, and then we took the average over these years. So on the whole, the primary, secondary, and tertiary sector constitute about 18%, 25%, and 57% of the economy. This is at the national level. The states where the primary sectors are primary sector is prominent, that include Andhra Pradesh, Arunachal Pradesh, Assam, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, Nagaland, Rajasthan, and Tripura. Most of these states also haven't been doing so good in terms of their growth over the sample period. But nevertheless, however, in terms of the impact of the pandemic, given the nature of the work that is involved in the primary sector and the other two sectors, so probably these are the states, where the impact of the pandemic could be relatively less severe. So the states where the primary sector, particularly the agriculture, forestry, and fishing, where this sector is prominent, probably there the impact of the pandemic will be less severe compared to a state where the secondary sector or the tertiary sector is more prominent. Then the secondary sector accounts for more than 35% in Chhattisgarh, Goa, Gujarat, Himachal Pradesh, Puducherry, Sikkim, Tamil Nadu, and Uttarakhand. And finally, tertiary sector generates more than 60% of income in Union Territory of Andaman and Nicobar, Chandigarh, Delhi, Karnataka, Kerala, and Telangana. So these states where the secondary sector and tertiary sector, these two sectors are prominent, we expect that there the impact of the lockdown and therefore the impact of the pandemic will be severe compared to the states where the primary sector is prominent. This is now we do in terms of, however, distribution of workers. So we have the same classification of sectors and subsectors. So here again, the argument is the same, that the states where the primary sector, especially the agriculture, forestry, fishing, this sector is prominent, there the impact will be less severe compared to the states where the secondary and tertiary sectors are more prominent. So what we see here is that at the national level, 43% usually working, of the labor force in Bihar prominent. So of the secondary sector, Punjab, Tamil Nadu, Dadar and Nagar Haveli, and Daman and Diu. And the tertiary sector employs much larger proportions of workers in Andaman and Nicobar, Arunachal Pradesh, Chandigarh, Delhi, Goa, Haryana, Kerala, Lakshadweep, Manipur, Nagaland, Puducherry, Punjab, Sikkim, and Tripura. So when I say larger proportions or substantially higher, this is in relation to what it is at the national level. So I guess the argument is clear that we are looking at the sectoral compositions in terms of GVA, gross value addition, as well as the share of in employment, with this understanding that the stage where in terms of GVA generation as well as employment generation, the primary sector is prominent there, the impact of the lockdown or the pandemic could be less severe compared to the states where the secondary and the tertiary sectors are more prominent. Moving on to the last indicator of economic performance, which is the fiscal position of the state. So we have data on revenue deficit, fiscal deficit, and primary deficits over the years 2016-17 to 2019-20. Again, I'm summing up here the main points. So we found that in 2019-20, the last year for which we had the data, 18 states and Delhi have had revenue surpluses. However, states and union territories have fiscal deficit in that year. States have fiscal deficit above 3%, which is mandated by the FRBM Act. And states such as Goa, Himachal Pradesh, Manipur, and Union Territories of Jammu and Kashmir experience very high levels of fiscal deficit. On the other hand, if you look at the primary deficit, you'll find that except for Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland, West Bengal, and Puducherry, the remaining states in Union Territory experience primary deficit. And Goa, Jharkhand, Manipur, and Orissa had large primary deficit. Now, if you compare the fiscal deficit figures for the states and the primary deficit figures for the states, then you will find that for most of these states, while the primary deficit numbers are smaller, the fiscal deficit is high. Now we know the difference between the primary fiscal deficit and primary deficit is nothing but the interest payment. So primary deficit plus the interest payment is the fiscal deficit. So as smaller primary deficit figures and higher corresponding fiscal deficit figure imply that most of the states have already borrowed large amount and they have high interest payment obligations. Sort of implies is that these states probably are not therefore in terms of their fiscal because they have already borrowed a lot, and therefore to fight the pandemic they are going to face trouble because they already have large interest payment obligations. So this is how we look at pre-COVID economic scenarios across states in terms of GDP growth performance, the sectoral compositions, unemployment rate, and fiscal positions. Okay, and now I move to the second issue, which is the spread of the virus across states and the containment efforts taken by put in place by the states. Tables, what we have here is number of confirmed cases across states and union territories to March 1st, and then we have the total numbers, but these are all in per million numbers. So I would like to one thing clear here, of course, will not tell you with the absolute number of confirmed cases. If you look at the COVID-19, India, that org, the data, you know that 5 or 6 states constitute about 60% of the total confirmed cases. But if you look at our number, however, these numbers may not tell you with those numbers because because we need to compare the states. So therefore, we need to normalize. Need to have some comparable numbers. So therefore, we normalize these confirmed cases by the total population, and in fact, per million of populations. And this gives us, therefore, the comparable numbers. Of course, we have data only up to August. In the last, 1 month, things might have changed. But I guess largely the trend in terms of, the per million confirmed cases, probably it has remained more or less same. So as you can see that March to May, if you see, the number of cases were not very high, which points to the fact that the lockdown probably was effective in containing the spread of the virus. Though towards the end of the lockdown, that is during May, in some states, the number picked up. But as we started the unlock process from June onwards, it started picking up. I mean, they started really increasing. So on the whole, now we have states like, Andhra Pradesh, as you can see here, then Delhi, Goa, and then Karnataka, Ladakh, Maharashtra, Puducherry, Tamil Nadu. These are some states in Union Territories where the incidence is very high. You can see per million, the number is high relatively. Then positivity rate and case fatality rate. Positivity rate is like out of the per 100% tested, how many turn out to be positive. So you can see again Andhra Pradesh, Chandigarh, Delhi, Goa, Karnataka, Maharashtra, then Puducherry, Tamil Nadu, Telangana, these West Bengal. These are the states where the positivity rate is very high. In terms case fatality rate, again, out of 100 cases, how many persons died? Confirmed cases, how many persons died? So there you will have like Chandigarh, Delhi, Gujarat, JNK, Maharashtra, in fact, is very high. And then Bengal, Uttarakhand, even Uttar Pradesh, Punjab, these are some of the states in Union Territory where it is more than 2% and relatively higher. And finally, effort, we look at the number of tests per million conducted as a proxy for the effort. States, as you'd agree that in absence of any medicine or vaccine, the strategy, the effective strategy that a state or a country can adopt is to test as many cases as possible, as many people as possible, and then identify, trace, and isolate. That is the effective strategy that most of the states where they, and countries where they have been able to contain the virus, that is the strategy that they have adopted. So therefore, as a proxy for the state's effort to contain the virus, to spread of the virus, we take number of tests per million. And we find that, some of the states, really lag behind, like, Meghalaya, Mizoram, Manipur, Madhya Pradesh, it's just 17,511 tests per million. Karnataka even, and then Bihar, these states, most of the northeastern state except Arunachal Pradesh, then East, Orissa, Punjab. So these states, Telangana, step up the Pradesh. Though the cases may not be very high, they are confirmed cases, but if you see the per million number of cases per million, then Arunachal Pradesh is pretty high. Goa, high. Delhi is also high, and even JNK, Ladakh, so those places, the number of tests conducted per million of population is pretty high. So there are few states where I don't know if I can say that they have conducted sufficient tests, but the numbers are relatively higher. But there are many states where the efforts probably are not up to the mark if we look at number of tests conducted per million. So now, given these two scenarios, one, how the states have put in place the effort to contain the virus and how the virus itself has spread, the speed, the incidence of the spread of the virus, given that. And the first issue that I discussed, the economic condition of the states or the economic performances of the states on the eve of COVID-19. Two situations, two scenarios. Now, let us see how the virus, the pandemic, has impacted the economies of the states. And I'll stop here and ask Dr. Mandal to take over.
Thank you very much, Vinod, for making a rather technical work sound rather simple. Basically, that are very interesting and important. But then we'll not discuss it again here now. We'll leave at least 10 minutes towards the end for discussion. So I'll invite Dr. Raju Mandal to make his presentation, but I'll warn the house that he's got a slightly sore throat, so his voice may be a little hoarse. Raju, please come in.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. Okay, thank you, sir. Hello, everybody. As Professor Bezburwa already mentioned in the beginning, that the ongoing project with Dr. Goswami and Professor Nath. So basically, I will be talking about the economic impacts of COVID-19 across the states and union territories of India, and I will be highlighting the reasons. What could be the reasons? Variations in the impacts across the states of India. So here, basically, I will mean the states and union territories. Okay, so as you all know that 19 is perhaps the biggest pandemic affecting the entire world and it has affected all the economies across the countries and even within the same country. As regards the impact on India, there's current financial year, which shows that the GDP of India contracted last year's first quarter. But as the experts, the actual magnitude and what the official available data reveal. The experts like Professor Panopshen, according to him, 32%. And this adverse economic impact of the pandemic would be quite uneven across this. There would be some states which would be suffering much more damage than the official 4% or the unofficial figures of around 33 or 32%. We expect the impacts to be quite uneven across states of India due to the differences in their basic characteristics, which have been already mentioned by Dr. But again, I will be highlighting here some of the points because I would be coming to these points and try to explain whether these factors can explain in the observed variations in the impact of COVID-19 across the states of India. So first of all, the states are not equally positioned on the eve of the pandemic. Some states were having a better, relatively better economic growth rate and other macroeconomic parameters. So those are the ones that are expected to be less affected compared to others. Similarly, the states which have a higher share of manufacturing sector in their state GDPs, they are likely to be more affected due to the lockdown and other restrictions. Similarly, which had a better fiscal position, they could probably put more resources to fight out the pandemic and also take appropriate steps to prevent the damage and have an early recovery. Likewise, all the states are not affected by the pandemic at the same time. For example, the state of Assam, the outbreak happened quite late on the last day of March, I think. So the states which had a later, which got late outbreak, they could have some time to make some preparations and by building some health infrastructure, and thus they could be better prepared, and thus they are expected to be, in a better position to fight out the pandemic and have early recovery. Now I'm going to speak about the impact across the differential impact of COVID-19 across the sectors of India and what implications they have for economies. The pandemic-induced national lockdown, it coincided with the harvesting time of the Rabi crops. The product was not affected by the lockdown. However, the lockdown severely disrupted the restrictions on movement of vehicles and occasional closure of the regulated markets. In the states like Punjab, Haryana, Uttar Pradesh, for their large farms, so there the migrant workers from Bihar, then Orissa, West Bengal, they perform a lot of activities in case of harvesting and post-harvesting activities like storage and all. So when the lockdown happened and these laborers, they moved back to their home states, the states like Punjab, Haryana, Uttar Pradesh, of shortage of labor, which affected us adversely their post-harvesting handling of the crops. And moreover, due to the supply chain, there was also some adverse effect on the food processing industries. There were the farmers had to throw away the in different parts of the country. Moreover, there was a sharp fall in the market arrivals of the fruits and vegetables. So the some studies, they show that the market arrivals of fruits and vegetables, they declined by around 25 to 50% of the produce compared to the last year. So given the importance of the agricultural products for food security, food livelihood of the farmers, the governments at different levels had to respond to the difficulties faced by the consumers and the farmers in the initial phase of the lockdown. As a result, there are some state interventions taken at different levels. For example, the Indian Council of Agricultural Research, it issued guidelines for the farmers to be followed during harvesting and for harvesting operation. Likewise, the Union Home Ministry, it removed the restrictions on intra and interstate movements of farmers, farm workers, and farm equipment during the later phases of the lockdown. Likewise, the state governments were asked to ensure operation of the wholesale markets. Then several states, they classified food as essential and directed the local administration to ensure that the essential food items like groceries, vegetables, fruits, milk, etc., is not affected. Due to all these interventions from the government side, government side, the damage to the agricultural sector actually was quite moderate, and it prevented the loss in the agricultural sector from taking catastrophic proportions. Okay. So as a result, the agriculture sector turned out to be the only sector that registered a positive growth rate during the first quarter. This, with more contribution from agriculture and allied activities, seem to have benefited more from this positive growth rate in the agriculture sector. Like Andhra Pradesh, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Punjab, Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh, West Bengal, and a few states in Northeast, they had, hello?
Yeah, move on.
They had a minimum impact of the lockdown in their agriculture sector. Sir, can you see my slide?
I cannot, but you can. You should keep on speaking. Otherwise, our time will be lost. No?
Okay. Fine, sir.
Yeah, go on speaking. Don't wait for the slides.
Yes, sir. Then within the sector, the registered a negative growth rate since March, and the highest contraction being observed in the month of April, when it contracted by 27%. And although it was declared essential, and some which have prominent share in the mining sector, they issued some guidelines for its operation. Shortage of labor during the time period could not help its complete recovery of the mining sector. So the states like Assam and other states which have a prominent share in the mining sector, they suffered due to the decline or contraction in the mining. Now moving on to the industrial sector, although the lockdown had a moderate impact on the agriculture sector, but it had a devastating impact on the manufacturing sector. The year-on-year manufacturing growth rate somewhat accelerated in February, then it quickly turned negative in March, and April was the most devastating month when the manufacturing production shrank by 2/3. However, as restrictions were gradually removed in May, this sector recovered a bit, which was mostly fueled by the positive growth in the production of medical and pharmaceutical products. But the impact on the sector, I mean manufacturing sector, was so severe that as a whole in the first quarter it contracted by around 39%.
Yes, Raju, would you mind speeding up a little because we are running short of time?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So the states with substantially larger manufacturing suffered the most, and they include the states like Goa, Gujarat, Haryana, Himachal Pradesh, Jharkhand, Uttarakhand, Tamil Nadu. Then, regarding the service sector impact, it is evident that the India's service sector contracted for 4 consecutive months since March. As a result, in the first quarter, it declined by 47%. So, although all the states have now a significant share of service sector in their state GDPs, but the states which have a considerably higher share of service sector in their GDP are Andaman, Nicobar, Chandigarh, Delhi, Karnataka, Kerala, and Telangana, and they are expected to suffer the most due to the pandemic. It may be noted here that the northeastern states, although they have a relatively large service sector, but the public administration contribute a lot to the services income, so they are unlikely to be hurt as much as the other states which have a large share of the private service sector. Then the lockdown has a disproportionate effect on certain components of the service sector like trade and transport, travel, tourism, hotel and restaurants. So the worst sufferers would be the states which are more dependent on the tourism and related services, and this tourism and related services is perhaps the last sector which is likely to recover the last, because since the vaccine is not in sight, it will take some time for public confidence to go out for tourism and travel related activities. Then to explore what could be the possible factors behind the variation in the economic impacts across India, and we found that these states which experienced have suffered more economic damage. The states condition before the pandemic was a bit better, less suffered less. The states which has higher share of workers in the primary sector, they have less damage in terms of economic. On the other hand, having higher proportion of workers in secondary and tertiary sector, they have a higher damage. So overall, our evidence suggests that the economic impacts across the states is dependent on the initial condition just before the pandemic, the rate at which the virus is spreading, and the sectoral composition of the state economies. Then this COVID pandemic, it has affected fiscal position of the states differently. The states which have already suffered a higher spread of the virus, they already brought a huge amount of public borrowing. Falling tax revenue on the one hand and expected decline in central transfer on the other has left no option to the states but to indulge in more public borrowing. However, there is some limit to public borrowing because, as Dr. Goswami has already mentioned, that there is a large number of states which have a huge interest payment obligations. So, if there is more and more and excessive public borrowing, that may hamper the future development activities and therefore the future welfare implications there may be. So, the resource scarcity may weaken the fight against COVID-19 and it may delay the economic recovery of the states. Okay, thank you, sir. That's it.
Okay. Thank you, Raju. Despite your not being well, being able to sort of complete whatever you wanted to say. Just give me half a minute to. Yes, friends. So there are two presentations which are at the All India level, and my job, the job I have taken for myself is to speak a few things about the northeast region of India. So if you look at, and in fact, it has already been said in the other seminar on Northeast that this region has 8% of India's area, which houses 4% of India's population, and the economy size is about 2.5%. That is the what you call the GDP share of these particular. I mean, basically the 7 states I'm counting, not so much Sikkim. So that counts about 2.5% of thing. Now the point is that most people from outside, because they see in the map the Northeast to be a very compact geographical area bound by mostly international borders and all that, they think this. I mean, they treat this as one unit. Of course, they should be treated as one unit, but for a variety of factors, I'd like to apprise the House. Many of you, of course, perhaps already know, but there's a great diversity within the region. In fact, for a small area, there's a considerable diversity which comes from geography, but which extends into the social structure and so on and so forth. And this is something which we should not ignore when we're talking about the Northeast. So, for instance, if you look at the topography, the altitude, then if you look at the climatic condition, then if you all the geographical factors, there's a wide variety. Of course, rainfall is abundant everywhere, but the altitude is very high. Himalayan things to almost sort of it's to the sea level in many places. So that actually gives you various sort of temperature and various socio-economic environments through which the whole thing is sort of evolved. And we have great ethnic and cultural sort of diversities. Now, I'm not saying that you should take into account all these diversities all the time, but that is also will be very massive. You will not be able to do it. But one need to at least keep this in mind that this region has both hills and plains. 70% of this region is actually hilly. It's mountainous. All right, and it houses only 30% of population. Okay, so population density is obviously very, very thin. All these mountainous areas. On the other hand, the plains are about 30% of area, but it houses about 70% of population. Where these plains are, they are mostly in Assam, all right, and a little bit in Tripura as well as a little bit in Manipur. Okay, so apart from the other areas, you'll find the density is very, very thin, and if the density is very, very thin, actually these are naturally distancing. So you'll find that the spread of the virus in those areas are not very high. But Assam having a high density of population, it's very consistent. Actually, density of population is much more in Assam than in other states. All right, and that is why you find the pandemic, of course, the impact is somewhat higher. At this point,
basically, what I'm trying to say is that if you look at the picture of Assam, it is very similar to the rest of most parts of India. I was trying to show a map actually, which has failed. Anyway, forget about this. But if you look at all the surrounding hills, you'll find the contagion is very, very limited. It is basically, as I said, it's naturally sort of distancing, so it's not a problem. But in Assam, the things are actually quite different. Then, if you look at the Northeast as a whole, you find other day Indranil showed that there's only 3% of cases, whereas it has 4% of population. So it can be thought to be less infected area. But if you look at Assam, it is much more actually. It has 2.53% of population, but 2.8% of infected cases. But then of course, one good thing about Assam situation is that you find that death rates are somewhat less. It's about 0.67 and all that. But this can have several reasons. One is what Raju has pointed out, because the whole thing started late in Assam, so they had more time to prepare for take care of the patients. That could be one of this. The state government is normally praised for dealing with the pandemic quite well, and some others of course are doubting the figures, like Trump doubting India's figures. So some others are saying that Assam is actually fudging the figures. Anyway, I hope the third one is not true. So this is the situation, and the effect, of course, are similar. Like again, like my friends have said, because agriculture was very, basically a higher proportion in all the states of Northeast. And second thing is that the agriculture was opened up quite early and all that. So after the initial, initial shock, of course, initial some decline, the economy has, that way it was much more beneficial. Then Dr. Singh also wanted some kind of growth figures. I calculated some growth figures for the first month, actually, not of the lockdown, and basically say April. And there actually I used a number of indicators. So if I look at the number of indicators, the growth rate declined in that period in Assam from about 24% up to 20%. If I take some indicators, it says 20%, others says 24%. And after that, of course, a lot of things have been opened up. So I think the growth rate might have improved a little. So I think in the first quarter, if you look at Assam's growth rate, it must be about 15 to 20%. It will not be more than that. So that means Assam has done better than what we call the India as a whole. Now, the state which might have suffered very badly during this pandemic, I suspect this to be actually Meghalaya. Why I suspect it to be Meghalaya? Because Meghalaya is one of the tourist kind of destination, and the entire tourist season actually is gone because of this pandemic. Assam's tourism is in the winter. Basically, people come. So Assam's tourism was saved, whereas entire tourism of Meghalaya is gone, and income really might have really come down to a great extent. But then, as my friends have said earlier, because many of the states, they have their fiscal receipts are somewhat higher than the other states, and this is also because they are border states, and secondly, they are mountainous states. Actually, the cost of delivery of services is 2.5% higher than the average in the mountainous states, and that is the reason why actually the 14th Finance Commission have actually awarded them. This structured those formula into the devolution process and so on and so forth. Because they received that amount of fiscal, probably they have some kind of cushion, and secondly, so that probably these economies may not have been as badly hit as the other things. I'll just wind up my thing by saying that again, another aspect which comes up here. The other day, Professor Bijoy Singh was saying that the Manipur, the construction industry was badly affected because the migrant workers have left. So basically in the construction industry, that means they have more migrant workers rather than their own local workers. But the situation in Assam, as I said, was quite different in a way, because Assam actually has been suppliers of workers, not only to the other northeastern states, but also to states like Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, Gujarat, and so on and so forth. So Assam actually had a lot of return immigrants and so on and so forth. And a lot of people who were in the service sector. Service has been a very dominant sector, restaurants, hotel, hospitality, tourism. So a lot of them were, of course, unemployed, and many people, so workers were available available, because many people who are either early in the transport sector, they have gone down to sort of something like selling vegetables and all that, which has become commonplace. So they might have reduced the wages as well as, in fact, they have reduced the wages, and because the margins have cut down, has been cut down. So there must be a lot of poverty. I'm sure there's increase in poverty and all that. There's also pressure for the parents to buy smartphones and all that. For poor people, it's very difficult because the children's classes are being held online and all. So a lot of things, disruption has taken place in the Northeast too, but then state-specific effects has to be different because the institutions are different, population densities are different, topography is different, and of course, there are other differences. So I'll not like to go on and on. We don't have a great deal of time. Maybe we can open up this for discussion for 5 minutes. I'm so sorry we have wasted time here and there, because of technicalities. So please, if you have any question or clarification, you can please ask. Use your unmute your mic and ask, and then we can direct your questions.
Hello.
Yes, please.
Can I?
Okay. Thank you very much. Do you have a specific?
Nice presentation. Informative. We enjoy. But I look for a sectoral analysis in the sense that I wanted the rural-urban income. What exactly has happened to the rural area? Of course, we all know that agriculture has done well. There was no problem with the agriculture. But now these days we know that agriculture constitutes only 50% of the rural income. Non-farm income is now as much as 50%. And
Yes.
that non-farm income, like non-farm sector, services, this village and remittance. Best part is the remittance. That has been very badly affected. So what I feel that rural sector as per se is more affected because of that their income is small, and that income also it has gone further down. So as compared to the urban-rural divide, we have a problem more in the rural area than in the urban area. So what I feel that we could have done some field studies, someone would have conducted and made some type of a presentation that what exactly is the rural-urban. Thank you very much. I enjoyed the rest is very fine. And I congratulate Professor Bez that he has conducted very nicely. It is very nice. Thank you. I have taken this portion of the higher time. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think you have raised a very important point. And of course, you are very too kind to for me being able to conduct. I couldn't put on my slide also. Anyway, it was not even a slide map. Anyway, forget that. For the rural urban, I think there is separate study is required. And one problem is that the data for urban income and rural income separately are rarely available. They are not available, in fact. And probably Binoy and Raju can actually think into doing that in the all India level. If I may just add one point from the Northeast perspective, some of the states in the Northeast are not very urban. For instance, Assam itself is not very urban. It's only 15% of urban population. But Mizoram, surprisingly, because of a very artificially done thing, it's 50% of population is urban. So rural economies have suffered badly for, like you already mentioned the factors, because Assam, where a lot of workers had gone outside, that also have contributed. Remittance amounting to at least 1% of state domestic product were coming and going directly to the village households, which were actually financing consumption. and also agricultural, sort of working capital and so on and so forth. So those things have come down. And secondly, the rural areas, labor markets are sort of free entry. So whoever has lost job, they have come to the village. Even school students, 7, 8, 9, 10 students, their parents have lost jobs, so they have gone and joined to the workers. So wages have come down at some places even to 100 rupees. So in rural areas, the effect must be very, very high. And I think this is an area we really need to study further, and the study can go on. We may not get an answer right tomorrow, but I think some studies will need to be. And pointing, I think, thank you very much for pointing out. And Dr. Binoy Goswami and Raju Mandal should take it up with Professor Hiranya Nath of some way or proxy way of splitting up the total state income into rural and urban income. And actually, that's going to give us a more insightful thing. Only from now Northeast, without giving any data, I could give that particular perspective. So, so this is what basically I had to say. So we don't have any more time, I believe. So I'll have to hand over the mic to Dr. Soren Singh. And I really apologize for not being able to do so efficiently because of this technical snags.
Hi, Professor Barua. I must thank Professor Roy and Professor Raju Mandal. I think given the constraints of technology, the best that we could do. If you recollect, right in the beginning of the session, we had a technical snag at our end. So we had to move the venue and conduct it. It's basically the supply side of the internet. The speed was slow, and therefore we wanted to move it, and we did it. And then, of course, during the course of this lecture today, we again found that there were some technical snags emerging and again and again. So I think we are all getting used to the new technology and across the country, and this is obviously going to happen. I'm sitting in Greater Noida, the IT expert is sitting in Delhi, you are sitting in probably, one of you is in Guwahati, one of you is in Delhi, one of you is somewhere else. So as I can see, we are all across the country, and the bandwidth and everything does make a difference. So I think given the constraints, we have had a very good discussion today. I'm also thankful to you for bringing 2 young researchers and asking them to share their research with us. That is also very encouraging, both for the researchers and for people like us who learn what the young generation is really thinking about the economy. At the end of the day, I just want to make one important announcement. If you remember, the country is grappling with the 3 agriculture bills. Just a few days back, we had an excellent presentation from none else but Dr. Ramesh Chand, who spoke to us about the bills and did it so well. To discuss that, on October 5, we are having another round of discussion with different professors coming across the country. We'll have Professor Gopal Naik from IIM Bangalore. We'll have Dr. Meenakshi, Professor Dr. Meenakshi from ISEC Bangalore. We have Dr. Dadij, who's the Secretary of Indian Agriculture Society. He's from Bombay. And we'll have the Professor Sukhpal Singh. He's from IIM Ahmedabad. And then we'll have Professor Lakhvinder Singh from Punjab University, Patiala. We are very fortunate on the foundation of the EGROW Foundation. We have Dr. Ashok Vishandas, who has been the chairman of CACP for many years. He's our board member. He will be also there, and he'll be playing, most importantly, the role of a moderator in that discussion. So just imagine we have 5 professors and experts, and we have such a senior person moderating the session. So I would welcome all of you. It's going to be a 90-minute session. We will send you the timing and flyer by today evening, early tomorrow. It will be a 90-minute session, requesting all of you to join. Today's lecture will be put on the website tomorrow because there was a technical snag in the beginning. Probability the numbers have not been very high today. I'm going to request all of you to share this far and wide because of the beauty the young people will gain from the presentations, And people like me at the policy level will gain from the presentations made by three of you, especially Professor Bezbarua, speaking about the potential of Northeast. So as far and wide you can spread this recording, we'll be happy. So take care, and we meet again on October 5 around 5 o'clock to listen about the three agriculture bills. Thank you and goodbye, all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.